Patch 1.14 has actually buffed the Rellana's Twinblades by a decent amount to where the intelligence and faith scaling at lower levels are a lot better, but that is specifically to just the magic and fire damage. The skill Moon and Fire Dance has actually received a buff to both the magic and fire version. The magic version actually now goes further, it's faster, and this does more poise damage. For my testing, the projectile version does roughly about 30 stance damage, and at close range when you hit with the weapon directly, it does about 45 stance damage. Now I think the speed and the range increase is definitely the most notable parts about this. Actually turns it into a pretty cheap and quick projectile attack that can like stun lock smaller enemies, and if you have shorter openings, this can be a very decent skill to use. Also, the heavy attack or the fire portion actually has received an increase in terms of its stance damage as well. It actually now does about roughly 40 stance damage to like these smaller enemies, and I noticed against larger types of enemies, when all those pillars actually explode and land, it can actually do upwards of about 50 stance damage, which is very nice. Now, arguably the biggest change to the Rellana's Twinblades has actually been an indirect buff, because the Rellana's cameo has actually gotten a very good change, because this talisman, when you actually hold onto the stance, it just boosts your damage. Now, before the patch, you had to hold onto it for like a second and a half to do 15% more damage on your next attack. Now, you only have to hold onto it for a second to do 45% more damage. This is a lot better, because before it took you a long time just to be able to charge it, just to not really benefit off much more damage. Now it's basically 50% faster in terms of having to charge it, and you're just getting so much more damage as well. And with how long the animations can be of these types of skills, it is definitely just worth just having it fully charged every single time. Unless you do have like those very small openings when enemies just like walk away from you, then you probably just want to use like the quick uncharged version. So yeah, the Rellana's cameo has now turned into like an S tier talisman, and I do plan on touching on this talisman a bit more when talking about the other types of stance skills. I'll probably do that in tomorrow's video or maybe the day after, so definitely subscribe for that one. But all these buffs has actually made Rellana's Twinblades get into a pretty nice place, and actually very comparable to the Sword of Night and Flame. Now, I've always thought the Sword of Night and Flame was just like this way better as an option, and I still consider it to be the better option, because both the magic and fire version of that weapon can just do more damage, go further, and also have a quicker animation as well. But that's not to say that the Rellana's Twinblades is useless by any means, because I think the fire and magic version complements one another so well. The magic version obviously does that damage in increments, and it can be like little quick amounts of burst damage. So when enemies just like walk away from you from a little bit, you can just quickly hit them a couple times with the magic version. Whereas for the Sword of Night and Flame, it can't really do that. And also the fire-based version of the Rellana's Twinblades actually does a 360-degree radius AoE attack, whereas a Sword of Night and Flame only does it in front of them. So any single time you get surrounded by a bunch of enemies or against larger types of enemies, I think the fire version is more useful, or obviously against enemies that just are weaker to fire damage, or sometimes even just like small enemies that you normally can't stun lock, like some omens or some larger types of knights. Whereas the magic version is just going to be your projectile. If you want to pick off enemies at a distance, or if you have like a shorter type of opening, or against those really small enemies, this whole combo can just straight up just stun lock them. And it can even just be better than just using the light attack combos of the weapon itself, which the weapon is a power sense light greatsword, and light greatswords have an amazing moveset. Now the power sense combos I don't typically like as much, because the weapons don't actually hit simultaneously. So sometimes you get stuck in these like longer animations, and it can be pretty frustrating. But if you actually don't like the power sense combos, you could just one-hand the weapon and just use like the one-handed light greatsword combo, which is more than enough. But you will be doing a lot less damage, because you're just going to have the magic version equipped. And also, if you had the weapon two-handed and just spammed L1, you are going to actually get a straight sword moveset with just the fire-based version of the light greatsword. And actually check the damage. It's actually comparable to like a flame art infused broadsword. So it's not like the damage is actually bad at all with this straight sword moveset. But the one thing to keep in mind is that the fire version is going to be scaling off faith, and the magic version is going to be scaling off intelligence. And being that you have to go spec into both, you're kind of just like sacrificing half the damage by just using the one. But if you actually go into more strength and dexterity, then the Rellana's actually benefits greatly. Because for some reason, this thing actually does scale better off strength and dexterity compared to the faith and intelligence, which is kind of annoying. I wanted this to be like a really good faith and intelligence option, like the Sword of Night and Flame, because that one does get B scalings, whereas this one only is a C scaling in both faith and intelligence. But if you actually did plan on just like spamming weapon skills, then just going into Faith Int is going to be the best bet. So that's what we're going to be doing today, is just showcasing my Faith and Intelligence build with the Rellana's Twinblades. So this build is at level 150, obviously having 60 Vigor, 25 Mind, 25 Endurance, 20 Strength and Dexterity, and is basically putting the rest of the points into Intelligence and Faith. I have 35 of each. Now if you are at higher amounts of levels, I recommend just going into this more Faith and Intelligence. This build is only going to get better once you're at later levels, because you can just output a lot more damage, because these weapons have scalings in 4 different stats, so you're just going to benefit greatly at max level. As I mentioned earlier, it does scale better off strength and dexterity, But if you just want to utilize a lot more of your skills, then just going into the Faith and Intelligence stat is going to benefit you more. And being that I consider both the Fire and the Magic version equally as useful, I recommend us going equal into both. And there are plenty of staffs that scale equally of both Intelligence and Faith as well that you can just benefit off. Me, myself, I am going to go with the Staff of the Great Beyond. It actually isn't the best staff or catalyst to use in terms of casting your sorceries, but actually does cast incantations as well, and it actually makes it very convenient. Now, if you are at very high levels like 80 Intelligence and 80 Faith, I recommend us going with the Golden Order Seal and just having the Prince of the Death Staff as well, and then switching back and forth. It's going to make it inconvenient, but you're just going to have way more damage. Now, the staff or spells aren't really necessary for this build, but being that you are speccing into Faith and Intelligence, you might also utilize some. For sorceries, I have Freezing Mist and Rings of Spectral Light. Freezing Mist is just there to proc Frost to just debuff enemies to make them take 20% damage, and it does it very well. Now, if you do have at least 36 Intelligence, I'd recommend going with some more Ice Storm instead, because it can just do it faster and actually just do decent damage too, because Freezing Mist doesn't actually do any damage. And I just have Rings of Spectral Light just as a sniping option. It goes incredibly far, it's really cheap, does decent damage, and actually does a little bit of Frost build up too. So if you actually do see yourself using this spell a whole bunch, you can put on the Gravebird Helm, because it actually does boost the damage by 10%. Now, as for the incantations, there's going to be lots that we can use. Obviously, Golden Vow, Flame Memory Strength for just more damage, damage negation, and stamina recovery speed. Gonna have Blessings Boon for just a health regen spell. Some of the healing spells that just do it instantly are just going to be better, but those are only good if you have a Faith type of seal with like a really good Faith scaling. This one only gets like an A scaling in Faith, so you're not going to really benefit as much, so the health regen spells are just perfectly fine. And I recommend us going into like some damage negation spells too. They're not going to stack with things like Flame Memory Strength, but if you are fighting a boss that's more resist to fire damage and you want to use the magic portion mainly, then you might as well just throw in some damage negation spells instead. You could also use Howler Shiburi in that instance too, but Howler Shiburi does make you take like 30% more damage. So if you're not really confident in fighting a boss, then I wouldn't really use it. But if you are, then you might as well just throw it on. But as for some damaging spell options, we're not going to really use much because the skill already has plenty of coverage in both just a projectile attack and an AoE attack. But we are going to have Rotten Butterflies, just a proc Scarlet Rot. This thing just procs it instantly and actually is going to do 30% of a boss's health over 90 seconds, which is just insane. It is a long animation, so you might trade out every single time. But against large bosses, it's basically just an instant proc. We are also going to have Pest Thread Spears against those really large bosses. There's plenty of like dragons in this game, and Pest Thread Spears just destroys all of them. And you can also throw in Discus of Light if you go up against enemies that are just weaker to holy damage. And also, if you did have a little bit more faith, I recommend going with Knight's Lightning Spear as well if you fought some enemies weak to lightning damage. Now, as for the talismans, we do have the Shard of Alexander for 15% more damage to your skill. Obviously, the Rellana's Cameo, which is 45% more damage when you do have this stance charged for at least 1 second. Now, it is just going to be for like the one attack. After you use the attack, you have to just reset it again. But for the magic-based version, it is actually going to let you do the entire combo. As long as you are holding onto the stance while doing it, you're still going to retain that 45% more damage. We do also have the Millicent's Prosthesis, which is +5 to your dexterity stat, which is going to result in a little bit more damage, but it also does boost your damage with successive attacks. And with light greatswords, they're hitting plenty of times in quick succession. And we also do have the Phlox Canvas Talisman, which is 8% more damage to our spells. And we just have the Rakshasa armor set equipped. Every single piece is like 2% more damage. Does give you a bunch of poise, but it does make you take a little bit more damage, but it still performs better than like most lighter armor sets in the game. So there's essentially like no downside. And as for the crystal tiers, I have the magic and the fire tier equipped. Now, when you go up against specific bosses that are like maybe weaker to fire damage, you just want to go all into that fire portion. Then you probably want to have the faith tier alongside the fire tier. Or if you go up against enemies really resist to fire damage, then you probably want to have the intelligence tier alongside the magic tier. But if you're going to use both, then just having both fire and magic tier is going to work perfectly fine. But yeah, that's basically the entire build. It is essentially just like L2 or weapon skill spam the entire time. And when you get grouped up by a bunch of enemies, just use the fire attack. Or if you actually wanted to stun lock enemies like knights, then use the fire attack and just use the magic attack for like most other portions. Then obviously you have your other types of spells for coverage too. And any single time that you want to save FP, then I'd recommend just using like the light attack combos or the heavy attack into light attack. That is a pretty good combo despite it having a longer animation, but it can just output some nice damage. So yeah, overall, I consider this to be a very good weapon. Definitely at least a very solid high A tier. I'm not sure if I would put it into the S tier because I don't really typically like the Power Sense Light Greatsword combos, and the scalings could be a bit better. But if you're at those really high levels, like level 200 to 300, you're going to have many points into strength, dexterity, faith, and intelligence, and you can just output lots of damage. But yeah, that's basically it for this one. As for the next video, I do want to cover the Rellana's Cameo in more depth and talk about how it works with some of the other stance-based skills. And I also want to touch on plenty of the other different changes that the patch actually has brought upon, because there's plenty of things that are actually worth talking about and that are worth their own dedicated video. So definitely do like and subscribe for that. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.